It's right on time. Let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the 15th installment of the US Asia Institute's webinar series, Northeast Asia in Focus, titled Exploring China-Africa Cooperation Through the Lens of the 2035 Vision. For those of you who have attended our webinars before, welcome back. And for those new to the US Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Yue Wang, and I'm a program assistant at USAI. For background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 45-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and the government of the United States and Asia. First, we would like to give special thanks to US Asia's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible. They're Sands, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, Philip Morris International, Fairfield Maxwell, and Sontari. Additionally, all attendees should be aware that today's event will be on the record, recorded, and uploaded to the USAI YouTube channel. We ask that you please remain muted and keep your camera turned off throughout the speaker presentation. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please feel free to type in to the chat box or wait to say your question during the Q&A sessions at the end. Now, moving on to today's program, I would like to introduce our moderators for this webinar, Dr. Ding Fei. Dr. Ding Fei is an assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning for Cornell University. She's a development and economic geographer with research interest in the political economy of international developments, infrastructure-led industrialization, capital labor relations, transnational migration, and entrepreneurship, as well as today's topic, China-Africa relations. We're very fortunate to have her with us today. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Dr. Ding Fei to begin today's section. Thank you.
Thank you, Yue, for inviting me to this event, and thank you everyone for joining us. As the moderator for today's webinar, my job here is to give a general and brief introduction of China-Africa relations, lay out the broader context of Vision 2035, and also introduce our two esteemed speakers today. So since the beginning of the 21st century, the engagement between China and Africa has seen a remarkable increase across diplomatic, economic, social, and cultural areas. Let me just provide you with some key data points on the economic interactions. According to data published by the China-Africa Research Initiative at the Johns Hopkins University and the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University, from the year 2000 to 2022, there were 1,243 loan agreements signed between 39 Chinese lenders and 49 African governments, along with 7 regional institutions. So the total value of these loans were $170 billion. And China has consistently been Africa's top trading partner for 15 years now. The bilateral trade reached $282 billion last year. In terms of foreign direct investments, Chinese FDI in Africa surpassed that from the US since 2013. So Chinese FDI flows rose from 75 million in 2003 to 5 billion in 2021, before it fell to 1.2 billion in 2022. And in 2022, Chinese companies involved in engineering and construction projects in Africa reported a gross revenue of $38 billion. And this accounted for 19.4% of their global revenues, which is actually a decrease from 2010, which is a peak year when Africa constituted 38.9% of Chinese companies' global contract revenue. And of course, this deepening of economic ties is just a part of broader diversification and intensification in China-Africa cooperation, which has extended into areas like peace and security, human capital development, health, and digital technology. So the China-Africa Cooperation Vision 2035 is one of the 4 documents published shortly after the most recent Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, FOCAC meeting in Dakar, Senegal in 2021. So the FOCAC represents the highest level official platform for dialogue between China and African states. The inaugural FOCAC meeting took place in Beijing in 2000 and has been recognized as initiating a new era of contemporary China-Africa relations. Subsequent FOCAC meetings are scheduled triennially, alternating between China and various African host countries. Since the second FOCAC meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, each FOCAC meeting concludes with the issuance of an action plan and a joint declaration, which serve as a roadmap for China-Africa cooperation over the following 3 years. So the 2021 FOCAC summit yielded not just these two expected documents, but also this 2035 vision for the China-Africa cooperation. And this is actually the first time that there is a mid to long-term framework laid out for the next 15 years of cooperation. So this vision document is kind of short. It has 2,050 words. It outlines 8 key areas of collaboration: development agenda partnerships, trade, investment, financing, industrial cooperation, green development, healthcare, cultural and people-to-people exchanges, peace and security, and cooperation in global governance. So what exactly are laid out in this document, and why has it been introduced at this critical juncture, a time when marked by the aftermath of a global pandemic, the economic challenges worldwide, escalating geopolitical tensions, and significant political and economic transformations in China itself? And what can we infer from this document about the trajectory of China-Africa relations in the decade ahead? So to help us understand the broader context and future implications of Vision 2035, we are honored to have with us 2 distinguished scholars in the field of China-African relations. Dr. Lina Ben-Abdallah is an associate professor for the Politics and International Affairs Department at Wake Forest University. Her book, Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge Production, and Network Building in China-Africa Relations, was published in 2020 by the University of Michigan Press. It develops a framework drawing on Ting-Yating's relational international relations theory in order to analyze China's human capital investments and network building motivations in Africa. She's now working on a new book project which studies current Chinese government-issued discourses and narratives about the new Silk Road being a continuation of Sino-centric 15th century Indian Ocean exchanges. Our second distinguished speaker is Ambassador David Shin. Ambassador Shin served for 37 years in the U.S. Foreign Service with assignments at embassies in Lebanon, Kenya, Tanzania, Mauritania, Cameroon, Sudan, and as ambassador to Burkina Faso and Ethiopia. He has been teaching in the Elliott School at George Washington University since 2001. Ambassador Shin has a new co-authored book with Joshua Ainsman titled China's Relations with Africa, A New Era of Strategic Engagement, published last year by the Columbia University Press. He's also the co-author of the Historical Dictionary of Ethiopia and the China-Africa, A Century of Engagement. And he's also the author of the Hizmet in Africa, The Activities and Significance of the Gulen Movement. He has a BA, MA, and a PhD from George Washington University. So Dr. Ben-Abdallah and Ambassador Shin will each speak to us for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audiences. So without further ado, let's give the floor to Dr. Ben-Abdallah.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction, Dr. Fay. I think this is, you made excellent opening remarks. I also want to thank the US Asia Institute for putting together this wonderful webinar. And I am very pleased and honored to be joining you and Ambassador Shin to discuss this topic. So I'm just going to provide my remarks in the kind of the prompt that was provided to me in terms of discussing kind of what China's economic development strategies for Africa have so far informed the objectives that are outlined in the 2035 vision, as already explained. So my prompt was to speak about 3 areas, to talk a little bit about economic development strategies, and then move on to discussing diplomacy, and then military and security cooperation would be the last one. So I will say, with the presence of Ambassador Shin here with us, the discussion on military and security from my end will be very short. I will talk about critical minerals instead, because I think we would all benefit from his experience and expertise on this topic. In terms of economic development, the one biggest factor that that's both outlined in the 2035 vision, but also really something that is very frequently brought up by African Union and as well as elites across the African continent, is this question of infrastructure and this need for infrastructure construction in the continent. So Africa still suffers from a huge and acute infrastructure financing gap. And it requires, this is according to the African Development Bank, it requires roughly between 130 and 170 billion US dollars a year over the next decade to get across sort of this financing gap. And to close this big infrastructure gap that the continent faces. If we think about it, infrastructure is at the heart of economic development, and being able to have cities connected to the markets, to the consumer, to raw materials, these are very important infrastructure projects that facilitate economic development. And to think about sort of what the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, has already accomplished in terms of infrastructure and in terms of sort of promoting or helping with this vision for the continent to close the financing gap. I really like this quote by our colleague Maria Adele Karai, who is at NYU Shanghai, where she says, Beijing offers a one-stop shop for finance, insurance, and building for host countries when it comes to infrastructure projects, and its processes are often cheaper and faster than negotiations with Western financiers. And I think that this quote encapsulates really why a lot of African partners, whether it's elites in different governments, or even at the level of the African Union and African Development Bank, kind of hold this ties and connections to thinking about sort of the link between infrastructure construction and development, and in terms of Africa's relations with external partners. The GDP Center at the Boston University releases a lot of data on the Belt and Road Initiative. They do a lot of tracking for Belt and Road Initiative projects. And I went and combed through some of the reports that they've come up with, just to give a sense of how, what are we talking about in terms of financing through the Belt and Road Initiative and through Chinese finances in terms of infrastructure projects in the African continent, just to give an idea. So in one of the reports, so in the reports, they track kind of the Chinese financing development finance institutions, and they're from 2008 to 2021. So this is a bit kind of, they divide things up into pre-BRI, so years prior to Belt and Road Initiative funding, and then sort of years that are in the middle, which are kind of BRI project years, and then sort of in the last maybe 2 to 3 years, it's not a post-BRI, but it's kind of a post-COVID kind of a period. So just to give us a sense. And so from 2008 to 2021, China's 2 main development finance institutions, which are the China Development Bank, CDB, and the Exim Bank, which is the Export-Import Bank of China, provided 498 billion US dollars in development finance to sovereigns, which was 83% of finance provided by the World Bank's International Development Association, and a National Bank for Reconstruction and Development loans in the same period. So it's almost, if you can think about it, it's almost like on par with what the World Bank is basically is doing internationally. So of this total amount, at least $331 billion US dollars was given during the BRI period, which GDP kind of thinks about as 2013 onwards into 2021. State-owned commercial banks, Chinese companies, and other Chinese financiers provided, of this amount, they provided 153 billion US dollars to African governments and regional institutions from 2008 to 2021. During the BRI period, Chinese FDI, Chinese development finance institutions supplied 91 billion US dollars to African sovereigns, which was more than double the amount that was provided in the decade just before sort of the BRI. So we see this increase in funding during the BRI, early years of the BRI project initiative. Additionally, commercial lenders supplied 12.5 billion dollars, and other lenders supplied about 10 billion US dollars to African governments during the BRI years. Now, these numbers are very significant for a lot of reasons, but among them that are African perspectives on these development figures, right? So the Belt and Road Initiative led to a significant increase in the scale of development and liquidity finance. And so for African elites, when they look at these BRI projects, this is kind of what they are seeing, right? So it's an opportunity to increase sort of their scale of development, but also liquidity finance. We know from a couple of reports, as well as a book that's called Banking on Beijing, where colleagues at Aid Data have kind of established this link, a correlation between Chinese kind of overseas development finance that being positively correlated or associated with higher economic outcomes in recipient countries. And so we see there is this excitement about sort of BRI infrastructure finance, which is associated in many cases with sort of a significant increase, whether it's into exports or reaching the market, or so it's associated with a kind of an a boost in economic growth. And so for these reasons, we see how infrastructure projects that are funded through Belt and Road Initiative have been positively received by, generally speaking, by African elites when thinking about sort of the impact of infrastructure on development. So in the interest of time, and I'd be happy to kind of discuss any specifics about this in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, the second prompt was kind of to encourage me to think about sort of the diplomatic side, so to discuss China's diplomatic approach to Africa, and to think about this from the perspective of China's more or less kind of using South-South cooperation solidarity to shape the geopolitics and impact the global order. And to this point, I would argue that we have actually seen a spike in global South rhetoric of solidarity and sort of non-alignment and Bandung momentum in the last couple of years. And I think we are seeing this kind of rise of global South rhetoric and solidarity among global South states as a combination of sort of international events, right? So we have seen, for instance, the BRICS group in the last BRICS summit has expanded, sort of now it has become BRICS Plus, right? Inviting several members, and the reading is that during the next summit, BRICS is going to expand even more. So we see this this expansion, this interest in sort of in global South kind of based solidarity. I also think that the combination of also other international events, for instance, the humanitarian disaster that we are seeing in Gaza, currently has opened up an opportunity for Beijing to ramp up its leadership position among global South states. And even if it's not achieving really sort of the rhetoric of solidarity It's not achieving a lot of practical changes, for instance, for the recognition, for instance, of Palestine at the UN. It is actually helping to, or it is at least serving to undermine the US as a hegemon, that, you know, by with regards to sort of Beijing trying to kind of point out that its position has aligned more with the global South states, calling for ceasefire, calling for a whole host of other initiatives that are seen to be vetoed by the US. And so it's in a way an opportunity for Beijing to also undermine the US, even if it's not achieving concrete results to kind of resolve the conflict or solve some of these issues. So I think we are in a very interesting kind of geopolitical moment where we see these opportunities kind of play out with Chinese officials taking on, you know, more and more kind of vocal positions about China aligning and expanding its alignment with global South countries, voting alongside one another at several of these UN resolutions, and singling out the US as sort of being isolated and more isolated with these calls for ceasefire. So there is an opportunity here, and we see these international events kind of really playing out in terms of China trying to expand in sort of this solidarity kind of rhetoric, and using this to geopolitical purposes. The other thing that I think would be extremely important to mention here, and it's something that was mentioned in the introduction by my colleague, Professor Ding Fei. It's the summit diplomacy, right? So this is something that China has perfected in its kind of relationship with African countries. We have seen the consistent kind of showing up on organization of the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation, as already mentioned in the introduction, which is a summit that has consistently taken place every 3 years since the year 2000. But we are also seeing this summit take place specifically to focus on the Belt and Road Initiative. So we have the BRF, right? So the Belt and Road Forum, or the Belt and Road Initiative Summit, which has already taken place a couple of times, held sort of at a summit level in China, organized by China, and hosting kind of different state and government leaders from all over the world. So the summit diplomacy, I think, is also extremely important, because it helps kind of China situate and contextualize itself among all of these elites, a lot of them coming from global South countries. And it allows kind of for China to not only kind of present these financial pledges, which are extremely important, and everyone will be looking at the next iteration of the FOCAC, of the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation, which will take place in Beijing, we know, in the fall of 2024, but we don't know when exactly. But so in many ways, these kind of financial pledges are extremely important. To give a kind of an example to our listeners who may not necessarily be very familiar with FOCAC, in 2006, the financial kind of pledge for China-Africa cooperation for the next 3 years, from 2006 to 2008, was $5 billion US. In 2009, that number reached $10 billion. And then in FOCAC 2012, that number was yet doubled to $20 billion. And then in 2018 and 2015 and 18, both years, we saw an envelope of $60 billion US, as offered as part of this FOCAC. Now, 2021, we see those numbers kind of go down, and there we can talk a little bit about this more in the Q&A if there's interest about thinking about FOCAC 2024 and where we see that relationship going. But it's really interesting to note that FOCAC is not only about these financial pledges, that this forum diplomacy is essentially an opportunity for Beijing to sort of showcase and demonstrate this strong kind of support, to demonstrate its friendship, close ties to African countries. We have seen records of African leaders, state leaders attending these summits, so they are extremely popular among African elites. So it's an opportunity to exercise that sort of diplomacy through the summit. And to bring sort of attention and visibility to China's relationship with African countries. So I'll talk a little bit about this third prompt, which, as I said towards the beginning of my remarks, it kind of is about the military and security cooperation. So I'll kind of really tackle a sub-part of this prompt, which invited me to think about sort of mining activities and to think about critical minerals in the China-Africa relationship and how we see the relationship moving forward. And I just wanted to situate for our attendance, for our audience, where Africa sits in sort of in this kind of big question about critical minerals and supplies of critical minerals and reserves for critical minerals in the world. So just for quick numbers, we know that African countries, basically a lot of African economies are extremely dependent, right, on revenues that come from critical minerals or come from resources. But we also know, for instance, that China's economy and the world's transition to cleaner energy is extremely also dependent on a steady supply of these minerals. So we can think about this as sort of an opportunity as well as a challenge, right? So we know that since 2003, China has become the world's largest consumer of copper. It has since then been a big buyer of metals and raw minerals, and it imports hundreds of billions worth of raw materials and base metals every year. It consumes more than 25% of the world's supplies, including 30% of global zinc output, 25% of lead output, 22% of refined copper production, and 27% of its of the world's global irons and steel, as well as 25% of its aluminum output. So these are big numbers, right? And China is now the largest single buyer with a very wide margin of African mining output. In 2019, China bought $10 billion worth of critical minerals. In 2020, it increased its import to $16 billion, which is about 32% of African minerals and metal exports. So it's a huge buyer, and the increase keeps kind of growing. So we can think about this as well as sort of Chinese economy is also dependent in a way on African minerals, if about a third of those supplies are coming from Africa. But at the same time, China is also a huge investor in cobalt mining industry in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Out of 15 mines, out of 17 cobalt mining operations, about 15 are operated by Chinese companies. So we see here an opportunity for African governments to increase their presence in the global market in terms of this kind of global shift towards electric vehicles and cleaner energy supplies. But at the same time, there is a massive kind of dependence on sort of this Chinese-dominated kind of mining industries in the continent. So we need to see China-Africa cooperation move forward in the future towards creating more capacity for the African continent to take part of this bigger global supply chain in terms of, increasing the African share in terms of profits for whether it's electric vehicle making or, things that are related to sort of cleaner energy supplies or cleaner energy transition. So I think I can stop here, hand it over to Ambassador Shin to make remarks, and then I'll be happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Are you hearing me on your end?
Yes, Ambassador Shin, we are hearing you. Okay,
I'm losing my Zoom connection on a regular basis, so I'm going to leave the video off and hope that I can at least get through the my comments.
Okay.
But the video keeps breaking down. I would like to thank the US-Asia Institute for inviting me in. I'm very pleased to be joining Dr. Ben Abdullah and talking about China-Africa relations. I'll try to be fairly brief, in part because of my Zoom connection problems. But I would like to review first what I consider to be China's 5 major interests in Africa. And this is not what China can do for Africa, it's what China wants from Africa. Those are what interests are all about. The first interest is to have access to raw materials, critical minerals, oil to a decreasing extent as time goes on, and then increasingly agricultural products. The second interest is to export as much as China can to Africa. Africa is not a major part of China's market. It's probably around 1% of its export market, but it's a potentially growing market, and even 1% accounts for a fair amount of foreign exchange. The third interest is to obtain the political support of as many of the African countries as possible. There are 54 of them altogether. That's more than 1/4 of the membership of the UN General Assembly. Fourth is to minimize the impact on Chinese interests and personnel in Africa of a whole series of negative challenges, things like terrorism, international crime, common ordinary crime against Chinese nationals, pandemic diseases that impact Chinese communities. The fifth goal is to obtain more military access to African ports and airports. Looking back a bit at how sort of the US sees all of this, beginning with the Trump administration, the US has increasingly looked to China as a competitor in Africa. This policy continued into the Biden administration, but with a dialing down of the rhetoric and leaving the door open for cooperation. Xi Jinping's more assertive approach towards Africa and hostility towards the West contributed to the strong US reaction. US officials have been especially critical of China's loan policies and their impact on African debt, sometimes, quite frankly, exaggerating or misstating the actual impact of Chinese loans and financing. In an effort to compete more effectively with China, the Biden administration hosted the second US-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington in 2022. The US summit is not a direct response to China's Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, although it is often portrayed in that manner. President Biden said at the summit in Washington that he planned to visit Africa in 2023. Although a significant number of senior officials in the administration have visited Africa, Biden did not make a major trip last year. The Biden administration has given far more attention to Africa than did the Trump administration, but the number of high-level visits still falls behind those by Chinese senior visitors. The Biden administration has ramped up use in Africa of the Development Finance Corporation, which was actually a congressional initiative during the Trump administration. The best example is the funding package for the Lobito Corridor project that extends across Angola, Zambia, and the DRC. Because of China's major lending to Angola and deep involvement in the oil and infrastructure sectors there, the US-European Lobito project looks like a direct response to China's infrastructure funding. China and the US have different comparative advantages in dealing with African governments. The US is often quick to impose sanctions on governments that violate basic American human rights and democratic norms, while China avoids political conditionality except to protect its core domestic policies, such as Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang province, the South China Sea, some of its human rights issues. If African countries were to criticize those policies, you can be assured that there would be retaliation against that African government. As a result, China finds it easier to interact positively with African governments that have been criticized or sanctioned by the United States. On the other hand, the US often has an advantage in interacting with democratic governments, and especially countries that have strong civil society. The US has a long history of effective soft power in Africa, most of it coming from outside the US government. The US has a language advantage in Anglophone countries, and probably in Francophone ones too. The US often works closely with a number of allies, mainly Europeans, on African issues. China tends to operate without allies, although increasingly it is collaborating with Russia in Africa. Looking to the future, China's engagement in Africa is changing. While trade, especially Chinese exports to Africa, continue to increase gradually year over year, there has been a major decrease in Chinese loans for African governments. China's new mantra is a focus on small and beautiful and green energy. China also looks to expand people-to-people contact. Although not publicly discussed by either China or African governments, I believe China is seeking to increase its security engagement with Africa, and we can talk about this in the Q&A if you wish. The current relationship between Washington and Beijing is so difficult that I don't see any short-term prospect for cooperating with China in Africa. Should there be an improvement in Washington-Beijing relations, there are several areas where cooperation in Africa is possible, such as UN peacekeeping operations, combating diseases like malaria, on the environment, and mitigating conflicts. Elections in the US this year will have an important impact on the possibility for China-US cooperation in Africa, although both Biden and Trump may wait for Xi Jinping to make the first positive move. In his first term, Trump never visited Africa and demonstrated almost no personal interest in the continent, although a few members of his administration took the region seriously. Nothing has happened subsequently to suggest he would follow a different approach in a second term. Although Biden visited Egypt, disappointingly, he did not make a major trip to Africa as he promised to do. He would certainly rectify this lapse in a second term and probably host another US-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington. He would also continue to send high-level members of his administration to Africa on a regular basis. I hope that I was able to stay connected with you during this time. I look forward to your questions. I'll try to flip the video back on.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Dr. Benabella and Ambassador Shane, for your very thought-provoking remarks. Just a note to our audiences here, you can type in your questions into the chat box, and I will read out your questions to our speakers. Okay, I want to also take the privilege as the moderator for this session to ask you some of my own questions. One of the things that I think both of you mentioned is kind of the scale down of financial pledges and loans after or in the later half of the Belt and Road Initiative or after the COVID, right? I'm just wondering, and also Ambassador, she mentioned the promotion of small, beautiful projects. There seems a shift in the Chinese approach to development finance, especially infrastructure finance. I just wonder what triggers these changes beyond we know about the economic downturn. What other things might trigger these changes? And having read all these different kind of China-Africa cooperation action plans, have you noticed any significant changes in priorities and in the future kind of directions of the relationship? And are there any kind of institutional level rethinking, especially from Chinese financial institutions, in making decisions or negotiations on this loan commitment or other financial pledges? Another thing that mentioned by Ambassador Xin is kind of the U.S.-China relations. And he also mentioned about areas for potential collaboration like peacekeeping, disease control, environment, and conflicts. What I'm most interested in thinking about potential collaboration or possibilities for collaboration in the area of infrastructure development in Africa, and especially in parallel with the Belt and Road Initiative, there's the G7-led, largely US-led, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. Just wonder, do you see any rooms for collaboration or maybe complementary roles for US and China in terms of filling the infrastructure gap in Africa? Thank you.
Who would you like to go first?
Yeah, either of you, yeah, feel free.
Well, let me jump in quickly then. On the issue of sort of the shift that China is making in terms of moving away from large infrastructure projects, I think the fact of that is very, very clear. All you have to do is look at the peak loan volume of I believe it was $28 billion in loans to Africa in 2016 to the last couple of years, where it has been just barely $1 billion. I haven't seen figures for 2023, so they may have gone up slightly, but it's a huge drop from the peak. That is very, very clear and undeniable. The reasons for it, I think, are numerous. The one you mentioned is the economic slowdown in China is part of it, but that's certainly not all of it. I think part of it is the whole debt issue in Africa and the concerns in both African countries and China that maybe debt was getting to be too much of a burden on a number of countries, and that both sides decided it was in their interests to slow down loans from whatever source, not necessarily just China, but other sources also. So I think some of the Africans concluded that they had to cut back on their loans. I think China concluded that it had gotten involved in some projects that perhaps in the final analysis did not make a great deal of sense, and it needed to particularly reduce some of the huge projects that it had been involved in the past and do smaller and more focused projects instead, and particularly to move from loan financing to foreign direct investment. I think that is where the new focus of China is. There are probably other additional reasons out there why the nature of China's approach to funding African infrastructure have slowed down. As time goes on, there are going to be fewer and fewer really good big infrastructure projects to do. On the question of potential collaboration between the United States and China on infrastructure, I see that as less likely than some of the areas that I mentioned, such as UN peacekeeping or combating malaria. Maybe in the environmental area, there could be some collaboration, even mitigating conflict. There have been a few areas in the past, like Sudan, where China and the US did collaborate to some extent. I think those areas are more probable. When you get to infrastructure projects, part of the problem is who gets the credit and how you divide up the labor. Does one country provide the funding and the other country provides the workforce to build the project, or how does it work? And I think this gets very sticky. In any event, I don't see any of this happening until there is a better relationship between Washington and Beijing. And only when that happens are you going to see cooperation in Africa on any of these sectors. So for the time being, I'm not optimistic about seeing cooperation.
Thank you, Ambassador Shane. Dr. Ben Abdallah, do you want to share your thoughts?
I mean, very briefly, because I do agree with Ambassador Shin on all the points he made. Perhaps to just add one more thing about why we are seeing some of that, some of the loans, kind of the volume of loans go down in terms of, and this kind of small is beautiful approach to infrastructure projects. There was a Wall Street Journal news article published a couple of years ago where a statistic struck me, which said that that nearly 60% of China's overseas loans are now held by countries considered to be in financial distress, which is compared to 5% only in 2010. And it's a staggering little statistic because it just shows us how the bank can be in a serious, deep problem if 60% of its loans are sit now in countries that are in financial distress, right? So this also really suggests that there is, from that side, a very cautious approach to scaling down and to creating or pursuing more manageable scale projects rather than sort of these mega infrastructure projects, which have in some cases kind of contributed to this financial distress kind of situation. So it doesn't really kind of matter what partners in Africa, for instance, or in the global south are causing this debt distress. The point is that no matter who the lender is, you're going to pay attention to this one. 60% sort of the loans are going to countries within financial distress. And so I think that just adds to perhaps explaining or thinking about why we are seeing this pattern of decrease in the loans, which actually precedes, right? So it's not due to COVID pandemic. It may have been exacerbated during the COVID pandemic, but from all the reports we see from Boston University's GDP Center, it started in 2016, 17 when we start seeing sort of already this decline in these big loans. And so in terms of the cooperation area, I really couldn't agree more with Ambassador Shin. I think that's precisely my read on the situation. I think perhaps more kind of the excitement about potential cooperation came from the perspective of thinking of thinking health cooperation, thinking maybe even sort of in the tech sector, but even that now is something that is far remote, actually. Like even when it comes to peacekeeping, in my own research, I did not see a lot of opportunities or possibility for trust building. And that trust is extremely important when it comes to these collaborations, especially when it has anything to do with security, anything to do with technology. And the absence of trust between Washington and Beijing is impacting sort of these possibilities for cooperation, whether it's in Africa or elsewhere in the global south. So I agree that unless that is there's a reparation of those ties between Washington and Beijing, we're not likely to see the big scale collaboration. Infrastructure, I would have actually said or thought it would be an area where collaboration should be possible because because when you think about it, it's sort of some of these projects that the US is proposing, for instance, the Lobito Corridor, it's a transnational project that is going to be going across 3 countries, the DRC, Zambia, and into Angola. And there are lots of Chinese mines along the way. There are lots of Chinese also portions of sort of the Tazara Railway being in Zambia, also Lobito Corridor, the infrastructure that China put in a long time ago as well. So you have these questions. Is there going to be refurbishing of some of that? Is there going to be collaboration in some, ways, portions, parts of this, whether it's about sort of, solar power collaboration along the Lobito Corridor or actual infrastructure laying down of the rails. I would have otherwise thought this would be an area where collaboration could actually be possible. But then again, in the moment of this geopolitical rivalry and the tensions rising between China and the US, that's what's driving this conversation. Unfortunately, it's not African will or agency or willingness to see this collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you both. There's a question from our audience. I'm just going to read it out. Thank you for sharing your insights on this matter. One question on critical minerals, as Dr. Benabdella mentioned in her remarks, China has been a large consumer in the African continent and has been very influential in the global critical mineral supply chain. Since the U.S. is trying to decrease its mineral over dependency, how can the U.S. cooperate with African strategic partners, and how would China's influence in the industry play a role in it? Dr. Benabdella, do you want to share your thoughts on this?
I think it is. I'm trying to. There are several parts of the question, so I'm trying to reread it. When it comes to U.S. trying to decrease its mineral over dependency, I'm not sure exactly what. So in general, right? So we've seen the U.S., but also really European countries as well, like European Union, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and sort of this energy crisis that has been kind of driving all the prices up, and it has been driving the supply demand kind of on the energy sector. We have seen this increase in urgency and need to diversify and to kind of produce more or less greener energy, right? So there is this huge emphasis on green sort of hydrogen projects that the European Union, alongside with the PGII, which is the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investments, which President Biden had spearheaded during the G7 summit, to kind of collaborate between the EU and the US and sort of the G7 partners to kind of usher sort of this energy transition, this global energy transition, and produce green energy. So we see some interest, for instance, from the US, for example, to collaborate with South Africa. We've seen an example of that. South Africa at COP20 a couple of years ago, I want to say 26, made a policy goal to reduce kind of its dependence on coal. And so based on that strategic kind of national direction, national vision, the US has been trying to kind of work with South Africa to reach that goal and to cap its production and dependence on coal. So we've seen some of those projects kind of work in this sense. And I think it's also the case that the question asks about sort of China's influence in this industry. I mean, I think, as I said earlier, there is a huge dominance by Chinese mining companies in the mining sector in Africa. So there is also, China produces a lot of solar power as well. So it will be interesting to see kind of how the US possibly kind of collaborates with African governments to increase their capacity to keep the production and also the transformation of these raw minerals inside their countries, and not just kind of really export these critical minerals raw. And typically they would just go to China essentially for transformations. So I'll hand it over to Ambassador Shin if he has something to add to this. But thank you.
I would only add that I think that there are a couple of cases where the United States particularly has encouraged African governments, especially the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to seek better agreements with China on things like cobalt extraction. This all falls more in the competition category than cooperation category. The U.S. does have an interest in some critical minerals coming out of Africa, but much less so than China does. The U.S. has access to other sources, including some domestic sources, but there are some that are of interest to the U.S., and it will continue to watch very carefully what Africa has to offer in this realm, such as lithium, for example. I would like to just underscore a point that Dr. Benabdella made earlier. I maybe was too strong in my unlikelihood of collaborating in the infrastructure sector. She makes a good point on that. I do think that generally it's a little bit harder than those areas that I cited, but there actually has in the past been some possibility or some collaboration on infrastructure where, for example, General Electric provides generators for a dam that China is constructing in Africa. So that would certainly be an example of collaboration in the infrastructure sector. And I also apologize again, I cannot get my camera on, so it's I'm going to have to sort this problem out later.
Thank you both for your response. I have another, maybe the final question I have is about African agency and how, given this context of big geopolitical tensions, how should African states respond? And does the coexistence of PGII and the Belt and Road, do they increase the African government's policy space or their negotiation leverage was either government, either country? And what's your assessment of the level and the capacity of African agency?
Let me comment briefly on that first. A lot of this depends upon the ability and the capacity of the African government itself to have agency with China. China is such a huge, powerful country. There's no country in Africa that by itself can really operate at the same level that China does. A country like Nigeria or South Africa or Egypt, they obviously have advantages because they are much larger and more important. But what does a country like Benin or Togo do when it's interacting on a bilateral basis with China? On the other hand, there have been some examples where small countries have exercised successful agency with China just by how clever they have been and how they have utilized their own laws, their own regulations to good effect in order to extract more from China than what the Chinese company or the Chinese government was perhaps willing to offer. Other governments have not done that. They've just sort of thrown their hands up and said, do whatever you want. If you want to provide us with funding, do whatever you want to do. And we don't really care. There was a study on a project in Mozambique where that was the conclusion, that once Mozambique got the money that it wanted from China, it just said, you guys do whatever you want to do. Other countries have not taken that approach. So it's a lot has to do with the approach by the African government.
Yes, I totally agree with Ambassador Shin on this point. To give one more example of some of the ways we can think about this is the AFCFTA, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area. When you think about it, sort of it's a major opportunity for African countries to precisely do what Ambassador Shin was talking about, which is to say no single African country can on its own kind of, have parity with China politically, economically, or influentially in its relations bilaterally, but if together, right? So the Continental Free Trade Area is supposed to really provide a platform where African countries can sort of approach their partners together as one kind of group and not sort of in a more divided way. Another example to how some African leaders have done well, kind of in terms of their negotiations and agency with China, I think, is seeing how global gateway initiatives from the European Union and how PGII from the G7, or what the Biden administration is trying to do. Some of these projects they've served as a way to create more leverage with China. So we saw, for instance, last week the Angolan president was in Beijing. Well, he was in China. He visited Shandong province as well. But the sense of comfort with which the president was kind of walking into the negotiations with China was tremendously increased by sort of knowing about this sort of Lobito corridor and $1 billion potentially being kind of funneled from the US and also the global gateway to kind of fund this huge project. And that gives more leverage, right, for Angola, for instance, in its negotiations with China to say, really, so some, this is what I have going on with other partners, which China considered to be, potentially competitors or even rivals. So that gives, a bit more leverage in terms of this question of African agency.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Shin, and thank you so much, Dr. Benabella. Let me pass the mic back to Yue for summary and conclusion.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you to Dr. Benabella, Ambassador Shin, and Dr. Ding Fei for being with us for this webinar. We greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your perspectives and findings about this critical topic. Thank you all to those who have tuned into the webinar as well. Thank you guys for being with us today. Although we're out of time, if anyone in the audience would like to follow up with our speakers, please feel free to reach out to us, and we would be happy to assist in fostering further dialogues on the things that we have discussed today. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their days.